Well, women leaders were at the forefront of responding to the pandemic. If we think about our essential workers, if we think about parents, if we think about those who are at the front lines and even the medical sector. So I think that leadership has always been there. And in fact, one of the many lessons that we've learned is that we've largely overlooked it in terms of the value that we've ascribed to the work that different people and indeed that women in our societies do. When it comes to the role of the state or of governance, I have a way of thinking about how we for so long have perceived the state as something that exists over there as apart from us or as apart from society, particularly civil society. But in fact, I prefer to see it as a manifestation of, particularly through representative democracy, the willpower of people, which has only ever improved, obviously, the more that people choose to engage with it, and therefore the more diverse that it becomes in its representation. One of the other many lessons that we learned was just how all of these things that we were told for so long were politically or economically or otherwise impossible. The likes of rent freezes here in Aotearoa, the likes of raising benefit levels for our poorest and most vulnerable New Zealanders, the likes of flexible working arrangements for people with disabilities or for sole parents, were able to be done overnight, effectively exposing that this was never something that was politically or economically impossible, but that the barriers were those of political willpower. Which again takes me to the point of how important it is that our state and our governance is all more representative of society and of our communities and of the different cultures and, at the very least, half of the population being women. So when we talk about what kind of world we're moving towards, I think that the lessons and the evidence bases that we could build solutions from were there prior to the pandemic, but the pandemic actually exposed just how urgent these responses are. That is the likes of shifting away from a way of thinking about the economy in the frame of gross domestic product being the core or only key performance indicator. Gross domestic product, when it was invented in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets, was a concept taken to the US Congress, where he effectively outlines that this was a way to measure economic transactions. But he himself forewarns that it should not be in any way, shape, or form conflated with the measure of what he called the welfare, what we now call the well-being of society. The reason for that is that mere economic transactions and the measurement of them, even in mass quantum, cannot give you an indication of the value, particularly the social or environmental value of those transactions, nor the distribution of them. So to give you an example of just how flawed and problematic that thinking is, it's the case that GDP goes up when there is a natural disaster or when somebody gets cancer, when there is a car crash, because there has to be economic transactions in order to undo that social ill. So moving into a way of thinking where economically, particularly from the government's perspective, we begin to price or think about those so-called externalities that we for so long have continued to place on the bill of future generations and incorporating them into our thinking from the get-go. One of the many ways to tie these threads together, and I think, in fact, to lead to a far more progressive and feminist future.